You walked into the room and felt it immediately. Not from anything said, not from anything obvious, just a shift in the air, a response that was a fraction too slow, a smile that didn't quite reach, a conversation that continued a beat too long before turning to include you. An energy that said, without words, without anyone having to commit to saying it, you weren't who we were waiting for. And you knew. You knew the way you always know, with that specific, quiet, precise certainty that lives somewhere below the chest. The knowing that doesn't require evidence because it doesn't need evidence. It reads the room before the room has decided to show itself. And then you did what you always do. You smiled, you stayed, you made conversation and asked questions and performed the role of someone who hadn't noticed. You pretended, convincingly and with considerable effort, that the thing you had just felt with complete clarity, you hadn't felt it at all. And somewhere in the performance, you asked yourself the question you always come back to. Why do I keep doing this? Let's start with the first part, the knowing. Because before we can understand why you pretend, we need to understand what it is you actually know. Human beings are social animals. We evolved in small groups where reading the room, accurately, rapidly, without error, was a survival skill. Acceptance meant protection. Rejection meant vulnerability. The ability to detect social signals, to feel the shift in a group's attitude, to know before anything was said whether you were safe, that ability wasn't a sensitivity. It was a necessity. The social brain is extraordinarily well calibrated. It processes facial micro-expressions, vocal tone shifts, body orientation, eye contact patterns, response latency, all below conscious awareness, all before you've had time to form a deliberate thought about what you're observing. What you feel when you walk into that room and know you're not wanted, that isn't paranoia. That isn't anxiety distorting reality. That is your social cognition doing its job. Accurately. Research by Naomi Eisenberger and others on social exclusion shows that people are remarkably good at detecting rejection, often more accurate than they give themselves credit for. The instinct that says something is off here is, in most cases, picking up on real signals. You're not imagining it. You almost never are. So, if the knowing is real, why the pretending? Here's what pretending does in the moment. It buys time. It keeps you in a space where nothing has been confirmed, where the rejection, though felt, hasn't been made explicit, where you can still exist in the room without having to respond to being unwelcome, where you don't have to decide what to do with the information your body has already processed. Pretending is a holding pattern, and for a lot of people, that holding pattern is familiar to the point of being automatic, because somewhere in their history, pretending was the only available option. Maybe you grew up in a family where the dynamics were clear but unspoken, where you could feel when you were a burden, when your presence was tolerated rather than wanted, when the room shifted when you entered, but where naming that feeling would have been more dangerous than carrying it, where saying "I can tell you don't want me here" would have been met with denial or anger, or something that made the original unwantedness feel small by comparison. So you learned to absorb the signal and suppress the response. You learned to know without showing that you know. You learned to perform unawareness as a form of self-protection. But the pretending has a cost. It's not free. It never has been. Knowing something and acting as if you don't requires a constant expenditure of cognitive and emotional energy. The knowing is present, held in the body, processed by the nervous system, while simultaneously you're managing your face, your voice, your words, your posture, the entire external presentation of someone who hasn't noticed. That's an enormous amount of work, and it produces a specific kind of exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of effort exactly, but the exhaustion of internal incoherence, of being split between what you know and what you're performing, of maintaining a gap between your inner reality and your outer presentation for as long as you're in the room. Some people do this for hours, some do it for years, some do it for entire relationships. Friendships where they've known for a long time that the warmth was mostly one-sided. Partnerships where the distance was obvious before either person said anything. Jobs where they understood they were peripheral long before they were told. The knowing was there the whole time. The pretending just made it bearable to stay. There's another reason people pretend. One that goes deeper than strategy. Accepting what you know, fully, without the buffer of pretending, means accepting something about your worth in that moment. And for people who grew up learning that their welcome in any room was provisional, conditional on being useful or easy or small enough or whatever the specific conditions were, the signal of unwantedness doesn't just mean this room doesn't want me right now. It means something much older and heavier. It confirms a story. The story that says, when people see me clearly, this is what they decide. That I'm someone you tolerate, not someone you choose. That the warmth people offer is performance, not truth. And the truth eventually surfaces. Pretending not to know protects you from having to sit with that confirmation. If you didn't notice, it didn't happen. If it didn't happen, the story isn't proven. If the story isn't proven, you can stay a little longer in the version of reality where you might be wanted. Here is what honoring what you know actually looks like. Not confrontation, not dramatic exits, not announcing to every room that you've detected the shift in its temperature. Honoring what you know looks like giving yourself permission to trust your own perception. It means letting the knowledge be real without immediately explaining it away. Maybe I'm imagining it. Maybe they're just tired. Maybe I'm being sensitive. All of those things might be true, but they're also the same sentences you've been using for years to stay in rooms that didn't want you, to maintain connections that cost more than they gave, to be loyal to people whose loyalty was partial at best. Trusting your perception doesn't mean you're always right, but it means you take what you know seriously enough to examine it, to ask the question rather than suppress it, to consider that the thing you felt, clearly, immediately, with the precision of a social brain that has been reading rooms your whole life, might be worth listening to. The second part of honoring what you know is harder. It means asking yourself, if I stopped pretending, what would I have to do? Because often, the pretending isn't about the room you're currently in. It's about everything that leaving that room would mean. The friendship you'd have to acknowledge isn't reciprocal. The relationship you'd have to stop performing. The belonging you'd have to grieve because it was never quite as solid as you needed it to be. The pretending protects you from the grief. But the grief, when you finally let it arrive, is so much smaller than the years of pretending it away. You walked into the room and felt it immediately. And you were right. You're almost always right. The question was never whether you could read the room. You've been reading rooms since you were small, since you had to, since the ability to detect the shift in someone's mood before they'd expressed it was how you kept yourself safe. The question is what you do with what you know. And the answer to that isn't a formula. It isn't always leave, or always speak, or always confront the thing you felt. Sometimes it's simply, I know. Letting yourself know without the performance of not knowing. Letting your own perception be real. Letting the room be exactly what it is. And then, from that honest ground, deciding what you want to do next. Being shared. Psychology for the things you feel but can't explain. If this found you, share it with someone who has always read the room but never trusted themselves to say so.